Okay, so we're going to talk about what I consider to be 4 of the most important foundational beginner movements that you really need to master these 4 movements in order to be able to move on to more advanced exercises. So the 4 movements that we're going to talk about are a squat movement, a push movement, so we'll talk about a push-up, a pull movement, so we'll talk about a row, and an abdominal exercise, and we're going to talk about a crunch today. So let's start by talking about a basic squat exercise. So before you try to get fancy and do it with any kind of equipment, mastering a squat with your own body weight is really important. So I'm going to show you a side view and a front view, and we'll talk about a few different things that can go wrong with a squat and why it's important to correct those issues. So what I've got here is a little step that's right about the right height for me, so that when I squat down I can actually touch it with my bottom and then stand back up, and that's going to allow me to get the right depth, but it's going to stop me from falling over. So that can be a good starting point when you're learning how to squat. You want to position yourself a little bit in front of the step so that when you sit down it's like you're sitting back. You don't want to be squatting in front, you want to be squatting behind. So you want your knees to stay in line with or behind your toes. So that's one of the first things that are really important to note, is the positioning of your knees. If your knees come over your toes, it actually pushes your body weight forward. It can cause your heels to lift up, and it places a great amount of pressure on the tendons and ligaments surrounding the knee. So it's really important that we keep our knees in line with or behind our toes. We want to sit our bottoms back, and we want to try to keep our back flat. We want to avoid arching or rounding the back. We want to keep everything nice and straight, and we want to keep all of the core muscles engaged so that they're helping to keep our body in an upright position. Another thing that we want to try to avoid is going too low in the squat. If you come all the way down here, once you get past about parallel to the floor, your pelvis will start to tuck under and your low back will start to round, and that's going to lead to bad form, and over time that can lead to injuries and poor posture. So we really want to make sure that we're focusing on keeping our knees in line with or behind the toes. We want to stop just a little bit lower than my seat, so I would actually want to stop when my legs were parallel to the floor, and just coming back up nice and slowly. Okay, so the squat movement is a really important foundational movement for all of your leg exercises. If you can get a squat right, then you'll be good for all of your step-ups, lunges, and any other jumping and running type movements that begin in the hips. The next exercise that we're going to look at in our 4 foundational movements, in the squat, push, pull, and the core exercise, is the pushing movement. So for today, we're going to have a look at a push-up. Now, a push-up is a really important exercise to master. Before we start trying to lift heavy weights, laying on a bench, doing a bench press, we want to be able to keep our body in a nice flat plank position and balance ourselves and be able to push our own body weight. So when you're a beginner, rather than starting on the floor, it might be helpful to start with some kind of a bench or a step. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually drop all the way onto my knees, and I'm going to use the bench or the step, and this is our starting point for a push-up, okay? And you can progress your way up onto your toes, and then you can progress your way down onto the floor, and there's lots of ways that you can make it more advanced. And if you want to have a look at some of the other videos on our website, that'll give you lots and lots of different ways to do push-ups. This is a really nice starting point. So one of the issues that a lot of people have with doing a push-up is that they stick their bum up in the air and their core is not engaged. And so it puts a lot of pressure on the front of the shoulders, and it gives you a really poor body posture. So the important thing is to make sure that you've got a nice straight line from your knees all the way up to your shoulders. And when you're coming down, you want to lead with your chest. So at the finishing point, your chest should be in line with your hands. Okay, we don't want to have the face in between the hands, and we don't want to have the belly in between the hands. All right, so nice flat straight body. Keep your abs nice and tight. Try not to let your low back arch or round. Nice flat plank all the way down and all the way up. The push movement is a really good foundational movement for all of your chest exercises and all of those pushing and throwing type movements. It engages the chest, the front of the shoulders, and the triceps. So it's a really good functional movement because it's a compound movement. It's using lots of muscles and lots of joints rather than isolating one muscle at a time. The next exercise that we're going to talk about in our 4 foundational movements is the pull. So we've talked about a squat movement, a push movement, and now we're going to talk about a pull movement. So we're going to look at a rowing movement today, just like rowing a boat, but we're going to use a resistance band. Now, you can actually do this with any type of weight. If you wanted to do it with a weight, you would actually have to be in a bent over position. So the nice thing about using a resistance band is that you can do it sitting down or standing up if you have something to hook your band around. Now, these are pretty easy and pretty affordable to get, so this is something that you can easily do at home. We're going to actually sit down on the floor to do this. We're going to wrap the band around our feet. And if I hold the handles, the band is actually too loose for me to really get much out of this. So I'm going to just reach down a little bit further on the band to give myself enough resistance. So it should be a little bit tight to start with, so that when I row, the resistance increases. Now, when you're doing a rowing movement, you want to make sure that you're not pulling with your low back. We're trying to target the upper back muscles, and we want to be pulling the scapula, which are your shoulder blades. We want to be pulling them back and together as we pull our hands in towards our hips. So what we want to avoid is pulling with the low back. We also want to avoid shrugging the shoulders up, all right? Really important to keep the shoulders down, keep your shoulder blades down and back, and as you're rowing, squeezing those shoulder blades together and getting a nice contraction of the muscles in between your shoulder blades. They're called your rhomboids. So we want to try to strengthen the muscles in our upper back because we have a tendency to be quite tight in the front and weak in the back. So this is going to help open up the chest and balance out that imbalance that we tend to have between front and back. So this kind of rowing exercise is a really good foundation for all of the pulling exercises that you might do in a gym. If you do any kind of suspension training with like a TRX or another suspension trainer, or if you do any kind of bent over rows with weights, or if you do a seated row at a machine. So this is a really good starting point. The last exercise that we're going to look at in our 4 basic beginner movements, our foundational movements, is an abdominal exercise. It's going to be a crunch using a ball. Now, there is some talk about training abs versus training core and what's the most functional way to train. So the reason why I've chosen to do a crunch on a ball is that it's going to help engage our stabilizer muscles. And if we actually do the crunch correctly, that's going to engage all of our core muscles, not just the power muscles or the six-pack muscles, all right? So it's important that we do train our core muscles because they're basically the foundation of every movement. We did a squat movement. If we didn't have good core, we wouldn't be able to keep our body upright. When we do our push movement, without good core muscles, we're not going to be able to keep that nice plank position. When we do our row, we need to have good, strong core to keep our back stable. So the core is really foundational to all of our exercises. It's good to finish off with core at the end of your workout because that way you're not going to tire out those stabilizer muscles before you do all of those other exercises that need it, okay? So I like to finish off by training core at the end of the session, so that way when it's all fatigued, we're not going to lose any of our good form for our other complex movements. So to do a correct crunch on a fit ball, now fit balls or Swiss balls can be a little bit challenging because you have to use balance. Now if you find this too challenging, you can always start off on the floor and work your way up to a ball. The really important thing with a ball is that you've got the right size. So you can see when I'm sitting, my legs on about a 90-degree angle, okay? You don't want it to be too big for you to where you're sort of reaching down for the floor, but you also don't want it to be too small where your knees are up around your neck, okay? This is about where you should be positioned. And you can make this crunch harder or easier for yourself depending on where you position yourself on the ball. So to make it easier, you want to come down lower on the ball so that more of you is on that ball. So if your low back is supported by the ball, that's much easier than if you come to, say, this position where just your bottom's on the ball. Okay, so at a beginner level, we're going to come down to a nice, easy position. Our low back is supported by the ball. We're going to put our hands either by our ears or even easier is across our chest. We want our feet to be nice and stable. And then we're just going to lean back. We don't want to come all the way back over the ball, okay? We want to come just below parallel. So it lets us get a little bit more range of motion than we would on the floor. And from there, we want to engage our core muscles, not our hip muscles. We want to use those muscles to curl up. So the problem with crunches is that a lot of people use the wrong muscles. If you hook your feet underneath a bench, or if you have somebody hold onto your feet for you, then you're going to be generating all of that movement from your hip flexors. What we're trying to do is engage our abdominal muscles. So it's important that we're actually curling through the spine and that we're keeping our pelvis tucked in. We don't want our pelvis to be tipped forward and our low back to be arched. We want to keep that low back rounded and curl up through the core. So it's a nice controlled movement, very deliberate and very slow. Another thing you'll see a lot of people doing with a ball crunch is this type of thing. Okay? It's a lot of fun, but you're bouncing. You're not actually contracting your muscles. So if you do this exercise correctly, it should be nice and challenging. You can make it harder for yourself by sitting up higher on the ball, and by the time you get to 10 or 15 reps, you should be pretty tired. If somebody's doing 300 crunches, they're probably not doing them right. So that brings us to the end of our functional basic beginner movements. I hope that this will be helpful as you're beginning your program.